I think that Leslie and Paul covered a lot of ground, but let me try to offer a picture of why my organization, the Center for Democracy and Technology, opposed DNS filtering really from the start of its inclusion in the legislation, which dates back to a bill that Paul mentioned, which was quite a year ago, and then HIPAA and SOPA this year. I should say, so I understand the appeal of what Paul is saying goal-wise. Certainly there is plenty of illegal stuff on the internet, including but not limited to infringement. And it's an appealing idea that maybe we could find a way to make that difficult to access, either block access or at least make it hard enough to access that it signals to users that the content is legitimate. But as appealing as that goal might be, when you actually start looking at the consequences of trying to use the internet's addressing system, the DNS system, to do that, it turns out there are a number of problems. Ultimately, when we looked at it, we decided it was both largely ineffective in terms of having much prospect of a lasting impact to reduce infringement, and then carried risks of collateral damage in a number of areas, one of which is cybersecurity, and I'll try to focus mostly on that here, but I'll touch also on what a couple of other areas are where we saw potential problems. So quickly, the issue of why it's ineffective, I think, has been largely covered by both Leslie and Paul. There are lots of ways to circumvent it. When you're using DNS, the bad content, the bad guy who's put up this website full of infringing stuff, doesn't actually get disconnected to the internet. He's still there, it's still accessible, it's just one particular way of finding him is being interfered with. And of course on the internet there are lots of ways for users to find him. And Paul actually ticked through a couple of the circumvention techniques that are possible. I think that the most likely result, if DNS filtering is used against websites that are actually popular and have a big following, which is certainly true of some of these piracy sites, is that the evasion techniques will quickly go viral. The users who don't know how to do it initially will quickly be instructed in how to do it, or they'll be provided with tools and browser plugins that make it easy. They'll be given something that says, hey, click here if you want to make sure you never lose access to your favorite sites again. And you know, will users actually do that? I think a good point of reference is the different peer-to-peer networks. You know, Napster got shut down, other subsequent peer-to-peer networks were shut down. Did the user bases of those networks say, oh gosh, well now that I realize it's illegal, I guess I'll just stop using it? No, they tended to transition to the other peer-to-peer networks. So they actually took the step of downloading the alternative peer-to-peer client and starting to use that. And I think that's kind of comparable to what we're talking about here. Yeah, you have to download some kind of browser plugin or something to keep access to your sites, but I think there's pretty good evidence that an awful lot of people would still do that. And so I think in the long term, you don't end up with much of a lasting reduction in piracy. Well, let's talk about why using DNS can actually be harmful. And I'll start off on the cybersecurity ground. So as Paul said, for a long time, the legislation had in it the idea of redirection. In other words, DNS would be used not just to block a user from getting to the site, but to actually redirect them to a Department of Justice warning site that would say the site you've tried to reach has been declared by a court to be distributing unlawful material or something to that effect. That is just in flat conflict with DNSSEC. That kind of redirection can't happen in a DNSSEC world. It took a while to get that recognition across, but we did eventually in the debate get to a place where I think proponents of the legislation recognized that redirection was no longer going to be possible. So the fallback answer, as Paul said, was, well, let's try other kinds of answers where the ISP, instead of redirecting the user somewhere, simply tries to make the request not resolve so that no IP address comes back. There's basically just no answer. It turns out that that kind of solution poses cybersecurity problems as well for a couple of reasons. Focusing first on DNSSEC, DNSSEC actually has a secure way of telling a user that there is no such domain. So that's this kind of NX domain idea. So if we move to a world where DNSSEC is implemented and users are using it, they will be using a new generation of secure browsers and applications that will rely on DNSSEC for end-to-end authentication and will be expecting signed responses. They'll be expecting the cryptographic signatures that signal that in fact there has not been any security intrusion here. And when they don't get that, they're not going to just accept the answer. They'll go looking for to another DNS server to try to get a secure answer. So what this means at the end of the day is that it's very hard because for ISPs to not respond, the DNSSEC standard simply does not give them a way to issue a non-response or refusal to response in a way that is cryptographically signed as DNSSEC expects. So the browsers that the users are using once you have end-to-end DNSSEC simply aren't going to be able to take refusal to respond as an answer. That will look to the browser, because it's not signed, that will look to the browser like there's been some kind of hack, or at least will look identical to if there had been a hacker. So what all this means, I think, when you step back, is that trying to use the domain name system to force ISPs to do non-responses ends up really undermining the potential of DNSSEC. Because the point of DNSSEC is it's a technology that will be a platform for the next generation of secure applications. And those applications will look to DNSSEC and its signatures to determine when there is a security risk. And when they see unsigned, unsecure answers, the whole point is that they're not supposed to accept those answers. Those answers indicate that there may be a security breach. And so they'll try to route around them. That's where you want to get with DNSSEC. Now the problem is if you start introducing ambiguity into the system so that now, because of government mandated DNS filtering, a non-secure response can either mean there's a security problem, or it could mean that there's been a court order. Well, these secure applications don't know how to deal with that. If they build their systems so that they route around insecure responses, which you'd want to do to defeat hackers, well, those same responses will also defeat the filtering. And query whether makers of browsers and other applications can really be in the business of building these secure applications that are going to be routing around court order blocking. I think their legal departments will have a serious problem building in a feature that they are told is going to not just defeat the hacker, but will also defeat the government-ordered blocking of illegal sites. So I think you create a strong disincentive to actually create browsers and applications that use the DNSSEC capability end to end, because they can no longer rely on the signals that DNSSEC gives. I think a second way that you run into problems with DNSSEC is just the question of what this would mean for DNSSEC deployment. ISPs and other entities in the domain name ecosystem are not required to deploy DNSSEC. Certainly it is hoped that ISPs will choose to do so. Comcast recently was the first big US ISP to announce that it's rolling out DNSSEC. But think about what mandated DNS filtering by ISPs means for the ISP. It means that in some cases they're not going to be able to answer their user's query. If they're not going to be able to answer the query, certainly the ISP's preference is going to be to provide a good explanation for why. They'd like to be able to tell the user, well, we're not able to answer your query because there's been a court order in this case and the site you're trying to reach is not a legitimate site. That's what makes for a good user experience. If they can't do that because of DNSSEC, once they deploy DNSSEC, they can no longer give an explanation to the user. At that point, all they can do is not answer. Well, that's a pretty cruddy user experience. The user's getting error messages or hangs, and so it looks to the user like something's broken. From the ISP's perspective, that means service calls saying, hey, how come my system isn't working properly? It seems to me it creates a strong incentive for ISPs, if they're going to have to do DNS filtering, to reserve for themselves the capability to do it in a way that preserves a good user experience, which would be to direct the users to some web page that gives them an explanation. Of course, they can't do that. They do DNSSEC. So you put the ISPs in a position where they have to choose. You can implement DNSSEC and keep your good user experience. You can implement DNSSEC and improve security, or you can delay your DNSSEC implementation and retain for a while longer your ability to preserve a good user experience when you're ordered to do domain name filtering. So it's an incentive to drag their feet on DNSSEC deployment, and DNSSEC has been in development since the late 90s. This is a multi-year process, as probably many of you know. It's got some good momentum now, and there is a real concern that you start mandating things that are inconsistent with DNSSEC, and you're going to stall that momentum. So those are security issues. Let me touch on a couple other issues that my organization was concerned about with DNS filtering. One is the impact internationally. The United States State Department has been the world's leading voice in favor of a single global open internet that looks the same no matter what country you access it from. We urge other countries not to have blacklists, not to block websites. If the US goes and embraces a technique like DNS filtering, it's essentially embracing the principle that it is appropriate for governments to try to exercise technical control over what websites are available, what foreign websites are available in your country. And indeed, if DNS filtering were to become an accepted norm for how you deal with bad behavior, I think we can expect other countries to follow the example and to expand the kind of blocking they do. And this really paves the way for a much more balkanized internet. I think you can expect that when other countries follow the example and use DNS blocking, it wouldn't necessarily just be for copyright infringement. The precedent will be set that when there are foreign websites that violate a country's domestic laws, it's appropriate for the country to create a blacklist of sites and stop its citizens from going there. This is exactly what our State Department is telling other countries not to do. And I think in the end, a lot of the sites that would be targeted by other countries would probably end up being American sites. Our First Amendment allows for a much more freewheeling forms for speech than many other countries do. Many other countries get frustrated with the stuff that appears on American sites and is protected under our First Amendment. I think you can expect that other countries would be doing more blocking of US sites. And of course, as the mechanisms for this kind of site blocking become more common and accepted, I think in many countries you'd have a risk of suppression of political speech as well. So we think there's a very dangerous international precedent that gets set. A third area where we have concerns is just the risk of impact on lawful speech accidentally. Domain name filtering is actually a pretty blunt instrument. If you look at existing law under the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, it encourages companies to have a notice and takedown regime where they remove infringing material when they're notified about it. But under that regime, what the ISPs are notified about, what the content hosts, I should say, are notified about, and what they take down are specific URLs. In other words, specific pieces of infringing content. So it's a video on YouTube that is infringing. It's not all of YouTube. It's not YouTube's domain name. So domain name filtering really is a much blunter instrument than that. It's not going at specific pieces of infringing content. It's going at entire websites. And it turns out that in many cases, domain names can be shared between multiple users. And if you start trying to interfere with the resolution of that domain name, it can affect all the users, not just the ones who are engaged in piracy or other unlawful activity. In addition, and I think Leslie hinted at this, domain names aren't just for the World Wide Website, although that's one thing that they commonly refer to. They also cover things like email servers. So when you interfere with a domain name resolution, you can interfere not just with the public-facing website, but with other things like email servers that may not be public-facing, but which may well carry a great deal of lawful speech in addition to whatever unlawful stuff may be on the website. So there's a variety of ways that DNS filtering can end up accidentally impairing lawful speech as well as unlawful, and it isn't really a surgical tool. The last reason why that's the case is something Paul alluded to, which is the due process question, which I think is probably beyond the scope here, but I'll just say briefly, one of the things we were concerned about in the legislation is that it envisioned a process where foreign websites get accused in US courts. It's entirely predictable that many foreign websites won't be familiar with the US legal system, won't have lawyers here, won't really be interested or maybe have the money to hire lawyers here, and therefore won't show up. So you're probably talking, as a practical matter, about a one-sided process rather than an adversarial process, where the prosecution or the plaintiff, whoever it is under whatever system we've set up, makes the case that the site's a bad site. The site doesn't really show up to defend itself, and as a result, the entire site is interfered with through domain name blocking. And I think there's a real risk of sites, of mistakes being made when you don't have adversarial process. And indeed, we've seen that several times already in operation in our sites, which is what ICE has been doing so far to do domain name seizures as opposed to filtering. But they've already made some mistakes, as in the case of, there was a site called moo.com, which turns out is shared between many, many registrants. It's not necessarily obvious in a lot of these cases that a domain name may be shared. There's no directory of subdomain. There's no obvious place to look. But they ended up having impact on lots of registered users, not just the particular subdomain user in that case that was engaged in child pornography. So anyway, stepping back, what all of this says to us is there's a lot of value in having a reliable internet addressing system that tells the truth and is secure against hacking and just kind of works for the purpose for which it was designed. And when you try to inject DNS filtering into that mix to make it try to prevent illegal content, the costs and benefits just don't pencil out. There's a variety of reasons why it can cause problems. The end of effectiveness is limited at best. So we would say from a policy perspective, if you do a cost benefit there, it's not an avenue worth pursuing. Thanks.